Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping into the world of absolutism today. You've been exploring it, and we're here to help you make sense of it all. We've got some excerpts from a detailed document all ready to go, ready to pull out those knowledge nuggets.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period. A lot of intrigue, lots of powerful monarchs, those lavish courts you always hear about.
Yeah.
Really a whole different way of thinking about power, compared to today.
Okay, so before we get to all those juicy details, like the Sun King's parties, maybe let's get a clear definition first. Absolutism 101, what's the deal?
Basically, absolutism means all the power is in the hands of a single ruler.
Yeah, okay.
Usually a king or queen.
So not a committee, not a parliament, just one person calling the shots.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a big shift from that feudal system where nobles had a lot of power. Absolutism is about centralizing control under the monarch.
Oh, okay. Makes sense. But how did these monarchs justify having so much power? Did they just say, because I said so?
Well, they had this concept called the divine right of kings.
Oh, here we go.
They believed they were chosen by God himself to rule.
So basically, don't question me. I answer to a higher authority. Talk about a power move.
Exactly. And the divine right meant they weren't accountable to laws or parliaments.
Whoa.
Only to God.
Imagine trying to argue with that. Okay, so we know they had this God-given right to rule, but what did absolutist rule actually look like?
Well, let's break down some key characteristics.
Okay.
First up, centralization of power. Think of Louis XIV of France. He was deeply involved in everything.
Wow. Like a micromanaging, CEO, but for an entire country.
Exactly. And to manage this, they needed what's called a bureaucratic administration, a whole system of officials directly accountable to the monarch.
Okay, so a well-oiled machine to carry out the king's will.
Precisely. And to fund all this, the wars, the palaces, you name it, they had to exert economic control, often through mercantilism. The state directed economic activities, to maximize its wealth and power.
So power, bureaucracy, money, it's all connected. But where did the nobles fit into this whole power structure? Were they totally sidelined?
Well, their influence definitely declined. Monarchs dismantled those old feudal structures. There must have been some pushback, those who used to have more power.
Yeah, you don't just give up power easily, right? Sounds like a power struggle for the ages.
Right.
But the monarchs weren't just taking power, they were crafting this image, right?
They used court culture with lavish courts and ceremonies. Like, think of the Palace of Versailles. It was all about projecting power, reinforcing their image. It was strategic, showcase the wealth, the authority.
Yeah, Versailles. It's almost like synonymous with absolute power, isn't it? It's like saying, look at this amazing palace, I must be divinely chosen.
Exactly. Now, let's move on to some of those big names, those iconic absolute monarchs.
Okay, let's meet them.
Let's start with Louis XIV, the Sun King of France.
Oh, yeah.
His famous quote, "L'État, c'est moi."
I am the state.
Yeah, you got it. Sums up absolutism perfectly.
Yeah. Talk about confidence. His reign was so long, and Versailles really embodied his absolute power. But France wasn't the only place this was happening, right?
Oh, right. Peter the Great of Russia. He was obsessed with modernizing his country.
Really?
And expanding its territory. He was focused on having a strong military and using administrative reforms. He was pushing his nation forward, sometimes forcefully.
Okay, so a monarch on a mission, and then there was Frederick William, the Great Elector. He's the one who set the stage for the powerful Kingdom of Prussia, right?
Yes. He focused on unification and centralization. You can think of him like the architect, getting Prussia ready to become a major power in Europe.
So each of these rulers had their own thing going on, but that core belief in absolute power, it was a common thread.
Absolutely. It's really important to remember that absolutism wasn't the only system in the world. Other systems of government were developing at the same time.
That's a good point. It's all about context, right? So how did this absolutism compare to systems like constitutionalism or representative democracies, things that we're more familiar with today?
Well, in a constitutional system, there's limits on the ruler's power. It's a set of laws, a framework that everyone, even the monarch, has to follow. That's like a set of rules that everyone has to play by, including the king or queen.
Okay, so power is checked. It's a totally different way of thinking about governing.
And then you have those representative democracies where citizens are electing representatives to make decisions for them. The power lies with the people, not just one person.
Okay, so with absolutism, it's the monarch who holds all the cards. In these other systems, power is shared. big difference.
Exactly. And these systems are important to keep in mind as we explore the rise and fall of absolutism. Because as you know, absolute power doesn't last forever.
Right. Empires crumble, times change, ideas evolve. So what led to the decline of absolutism?
Well, economic troubles were huge. Expensive wars, bad harvests. These things lead to unrest, and they challenge the monarch's authority.
Yeah, it's hard to maintain that divine right image when people are struggling, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And then there's the rise of Enlightenment thought. Thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu, they started questioning that whole basis of divine right of kings.
So this is where we start to see cracks in the foundation. New ideas are challenging the established order.
Right. They advocated for individual rights, limited government.
Okay.
And these ideas fueled political revolutions like the American Revolution, which then went on to inspire other people. And of course, there's the French Revolution, a huge moment that toppled the French monarchy and sparked wider change.
So from divine right to revolutions, wow, that is quite a journey through the world of absolutism. Makes you think about how these ideas played out in real life, really shaped things, didn't they?
Absolutely. And these are just a few key things to remember. There's so much more to discover about this period.
Yeah, we're really just scratching the surface here. Now, before we get into more specifics, I'm just curious, what really stood out to you as you were going through all this material on absolutism? What was your aha moment?
You know what really struck me? It was how these powerful monarchs, who talk so much about having absolute power, were ultimately constrained by economics.
Yeah, it's something you see again and again in history, isn't it? Money, economics, it plays a huge role in the rise and fall of empires.
It really does. You can't build those fancy palaces and fight all those wars without money, and even the Sun King had to face that reality.
Speaking of the Sun King, let's dive back into some of the key figures we've been talking about. Louis XIV's reign long and lavish, right? That Palace of Versailles, the military campaigns, it was all about power and prestige. But as you said, all that extravagance came with a price tag.
It did. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about him. He is like this larger-than-life figure, really embodies absolutism.
Yeah.
But he also had to deal with real-world problems like economic limitations, and unrest among the people.
It's like you get to peek behind the curtain. He might be the Sun King, but even he couldn't escape those practical challenges.
Exactly. And it's definitely something that ultimately contributed to the decline of absolutism in France.
And speaking of powerful rulers facing challenges, let's talk about Peter the Great. He was determined to modernize Russia, make it a global power. He even traveled to Europe in disguise to learn about shipbuilding and all sorts of Western technologies.
He was incredibly ambitious, very hands-on, wanted to reform the government, build that strong navy, expand Russia's territory. A true reformer, but he also faced a lot of opposition, especially from the old nobility. They did not like change.
So a visionary leader, but he also had to play the political game and wasn't afraid to use force to get what he wanted.
Yeah, he could be ruthless in consolidating his power, but there's no denying he had a huge impact on Russia. He founded St. Petersburg.
Oh, wow.
Which became Russia's window to the West. He even brought in new clothing styles and encouraged people to shave their beards.
Wow. Talk about a top-down cultural revolution. He really transformed Russian society.
He did. His methods were often harsh, but he played a huge part in shaping Russia's future.
Okay, so we talk about Louis XIV, who just epitomized extravagance, and Peter the Great, the reformer, dragging Russia into the modern world. What about Frederick William, the Great Elector? How did he approach this whole absolutism thing?
Well, Frederick William, he was all about building a strong foundation for the future. He ruled over Brandenburg, Prussia, which is really a bunch of scattered territories, and his goal was to unify them, centralize them. He was like the builder, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become a major European power.
So less about fancy displays of power and more about that practical consolidation of power.
Exactly. He really focused on strengthening the military, creating a centralized administration, and asserting his control over the nobility. His successors, like his grandson, Frederick the Great, would pick up where he left off and really make Prussia a force to be reckoned with.
It's fascinating to see how all these different rulers, with their own personalities and approaches, they all contributed to the rise of absolutism in Europe.
It really is. And it reminds us that history isn't just about these abstract concepts. It's about people, individuals making choices that shape the course of events.
Now, we've talked about the rise of absolutism, what it looked like, who the major players were, but we also know that it didn't last forever. So let's talk about its decline. What were the biggest factors that led to the downfall of this seemingly all-powerful system?
Well, we've already mentioned some of them, like the economic troubles and the rise of Enlightenment thought.
Right. Those were crucial, but were there other forces at play that helped to, I don't know, chip away at the foundations of absolutism?
Yeah, definitely. Remember we were talking about that tension between the monarchs and the nobles?
Mhm.
Well, that didn't just magically go away.
Mm.
The nobility, even though their power was weakened, they still had some influence, and they could make things difficult for the monarchs, especially when there were those economic problems, or if they felt like their privileges were being threatened.
So even in a system where one person supposedly had all the power, there were still these internal pressures, competing interests that could destabilize things. It wasn't as absolute as it might seem from the outside.
Exactly. And on top of that, you have the rise of a more educated, more politically aware middle class. As trade and commerce expanded, this middle class, they gained more influence, and they started wanting more say in how things were run. They weren't okay with this idea that the monarch, even with the whole divine right thing, should have total control over their lives.
Right, like those seeds of democracy starting to sprout, people are realizing, hey, we have a stake in how we're governed.
Yeah, that's it. And as these ideas spread,
Yeah.
which was helped by the printing press and more people being able to read, it became a lot harder for monarchs to maintain that iron grip on power. People started questioning these old assumptions about the divine right of kings and whether it was really okay for one person to have all that authority.
So the whole intellectual landscape is changing, and those changes were creating space for new ideas about government, about individual rights to take hold. And of course, then you have those revolutions, like the American Revolution and of course the French Revolution, which really shook things up.
Those revolutions were huge turning points. They showed the whole world that it was possible to overthrow absolute monarchies and that people could establish new governments based on, freedom, equality, representative rule, very different ideas.
It's kind of inspiring to think about it, isn't it? Those ordinary people who stood up and said, enough, we want something different.
It really is. It's a reminder that history isn't set in stone. It's not predetermined. People have the power to shape their own destinies, even when things seem really tough.
So we've talked about the things that contributed to the decline of absolutism, but it's important to remember that it wasn't like someone just flipped a switch. It was a process, a gradual one. And even as absolutism weakened, its legacy continued to influence political thought and the way governments worked.
That's a great point. The ideas and the institutions that developed during that time, like the centralized bureaucracies, standing armies, and the whole concept of the nation-state, they didn't just vanish. They evolved, they transformed, and often they became part of the foundation for new forms of government.
So it's like this ripple effect, right? The impact of absolutism is still being felt even as it lost its grip on power.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes studying history so fascinating. It helps us understand how the past continues to shape the present. We're not just learning about things that happened a long time ago, we're understanding how we got to where we are today.
Okay, so we've explored the characteristics of absolutism, we've met some of those key players, we've discussed its decline. But I want to go back to something we touched on earlier. What if absolutism had continued? What if those revolutions hadn't happened?
Now, that's an interesting question. It's like thinking about an alternate reality, like what if history had taken a different path?
Exactly. Would we be seeing kings and queens ruling with the same kind of unchecked power that they had centuries ago? Or would it have morphed into something totally different?
It's tough to say for sure, but I think it's pretty unlikely that we see a carbon copy of like 17th century absolutism in the world today. Things have changed too much. Globalization, technology, the spread of democratic ideas, all of that would have put enormous pressure on an absolutist system. It would have had to adapt or die out.
So maybe we'd see some kind of hybrid system, like absolutism 2.0.
Maybe. Imagine a monarchy, but it has to make some concessions to modern ideas. You might have a parliament, but with very limited powers, maybe some kind of elections, but carefully controlled, or a constitution that promises some rights, but has loopholes so the monarch still has the final say.
So like this balancing act, trying to hold on to the old ways while accommodating the new realities. But wouldn't those concessions just lead to people demanding more change? Once people get a taste of freedom and self-determination, it's hard to take that away, isn't it?
It really is. Look at the 20th century with all the movements toward democracy and the collapse of authoritarian regimes. It seems like the desire for freedom and self-government is a pretty powerful force.
So even if absolutism had managed to survive into the 21st century, it probably would have had to change drastically or risk being overthrown.
Yeah, I think that's right. The world keeps changing. And if political systems don't keep up, they eventually just fall apart.
That's a good point to think about. Okay, so we've gone from the extravagance of Versailles to the echoes of those revolutions. It's been quite a deep dive into the world of absolutism.
It has. And hopefully this has made you curious, maybe inspired you to keep digging into this really fascinating, often surprising history.
I hope so too. Remember, history isn't just about dates and names. It's about choices, actions, consequences. And those things continue to affect our world today.
That's right. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into this stuff. You never know what you might discover.
Well said. Now, I know you spent a lot of time with these sources on absolutism. What were some of the things that really jumped out at you? What were your big aha moments?
You know, one thing that really struck me was that tension between the desire for order and the need for individual freedom. It's something that we see throughout history, and it's still relevant today.
That's a really great point. Absolutism, with all that emphasis on centralized control, it was really all about order, even if it meant sacrificing individual liberties.
Exactly. The monarchs we talked about, Louis XIV, Peter the Great, Frederick William, they're all trying to build these strong, stable states. And to some degree, they succeeded. But there was a cost.
And often those who paid the price were the people who had the least say in how things were run.
That's right. And I think that's a crucial takeaway from our look at absolutism. It reminds us that there's always this balance that needs to be found between order and freedom, between the needs of the state and the rights of the individual.
So important. And it's a balance that we're still figuring out today. How much power should the government have? Where do we draw the line on individual freedom? These are questions that every society grapples with.
Absolutely. And there are no simple answers. But understanding history, exploring systems like absolutism, it helps us appreciate just how complex these issues really are. It gives us perspective on power, on how we govern ourselves, on what it means to be human.
Couldn't agree more. History gives us this lens through which we can view the present and think critically about the future.
Well said. It reminds us that the world we live in isn't inevitable. It's the result of choices, struggles, turning points. And those turning points often come down to individuals, whether they're monarchs, thinkers, or revolutionaries, who are willing to challenge the way things are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into absolutism, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to chew on. We've talked about how absolutism declined, how those revolutions changed things, new ideas about government and individual rights. But what if we kind of flipped the script? What if those revolutions hadn't worked? What if somehow absolutism just kept going right into the 21st century? How do you think it would have adapted to the modern world?
That's a really interesting thought experiment. It's like, what if history had gone in a completely different direction?
Right. Would we see kings and queens running countries with the same kind of total power they had, centuries ago? Or would it have become something else, something new?
It's really hard to say for sure, but I don't think we'd see, like, a perfect replica of 17th century absolutism today. The world has changed so much. Globalization, technology, the spread of democratic ideas. I think all of that would force an absolutist system to either adapt or just completely fall apart.
So maybe we'd see some sort of hybrid system, like absolutism 2.0.
Yeah, maybe. You could have a monarch at the top, but they would have to make some concessions. There might be a parliament, but with limited power. Or elections, but carefully controlled. Maybe a constitution that guarantees some rights, but also has, loopholes that allow the monarch to maintain ultimate control.
It's like trying to walk this tightrope between the old and the new. But wouldn't those concessions eventually lead to even more demands for change? It seems like once people get a taste of freedom and self-determination, it's hard to go back.
I agree. If you look at the 20th century with all the movements towards democracy and the collapse of those authoritarian regimes, it seems like people really want freedom and self-government. It's a powerful force.
So even if absolutism somehow stumbled into the 21st century, it probably would have been forced to change drastically, or it would have been overthrown.
Exactly. The world doesn't stand still. Political systems have to adapt to survive.
Well, that's something to think about. From the grandeur of Versailles to the impact of those revolutions, we've covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive into the world of absolutism.
It has been quite a journey, and I hope it sparks some curiosity for you. I hope you'll keep exploring this fascinating history.
I hope so too. And remember, everyone, history isn't just dates and names. It's about choices, actions, consequences, and all of that is still affecting our world today.
So keep asking questions, keep digging deeper. Who knows what you'll find?
That's a great way to put it. That's it for this deep dive into the world of absolutism. Thanks for joining us.